We might begin. I can see that there's a few more participants joining us there, but I'll admit them as we're going along. So I'd just like to welcome everybody here this evening virtually to the Jackie Clarke collection. We were hoping against hope that we might have this physically in Ballina in our lovely museum, but as we all know, the COVID situation has changed again. So we are online and on Zoom with the wonderful Professor Colum Kenny from DCU, who has, amongst many other accolades, written a wonderful book called Midnight in London that discusses those very important days on the lead up to the 6th of December when the treaty was signed. Before we begin with Colum, I would just like to say hello to all of our regular visitors and volunteers and colleagues across the County Council and in the Jackie Clarke collection, and then to also welcome any new faces that we might have that wouldn't be familiar with Jackie Clarke collection. And just to briefly let you know that we are a museum and archive here in County Mayo based in Ballina, and we're under the direction of Mayo County Council. And I suppose as part of that, we are a very seminal and important part of the Mayo's Decade of Centenaries programme. So right from 2013 onwards, we've been looking at the key events of the seminal decade of 1913 to 1923. And of course, we're nearly coming to the end of that. We're at the treaty at the moment. Then will come the debates, and then we'll be into the Civil War. But we will deal with that in next year in 22. Tonight is all about the treaty. And as I said, we have the wonderful Professor Colum Kenny with us tonight to talk about it. I mentioned just briefly as people were coming in, your mics are on mute at the moment, but we will have a questions and answer session at the end when Colum has finished speaking, and you'll be able to unmute yourselves then. So I just want to thank Colum for giving his time to us. I'd also just like to thank my colleagues Anne-Marie Forbes and Sinead Brennan, who have been helping out in the background with this, spreading the word about tonight's Zoom and all of the administration on it as well. So without further ado, Colum, I might hand it over to yourself.
Thanks very much, and it's a real pleasure to be talking to people tonight. I certainly would have liked to, in different times, had we been able to assemble in Mayo. I have good memories of Mayo going back 40 years. I think the first time I was in Mayo was when I worked in RTE many moons ago, coming down. I remember making a programme with Jim Brett, who was Mayo Man of the Year. He was a psychiatric nurse in Castlebar, and filming out in Belmullet traditional music. Meeting Eric Cross in Westport when he lived there, the author of the Taylor and Nance, and I made a documentary about it. So I always like to go back to Mayo, but here I am coming back from County Wicklow, thanks to Zoom. I just want to say a word, first of all, about how I got interested in Griffith. I didn't really pay much attention to Griffith for a long time. I had some vague family information that my grandfather knew him a little bit, had done some work for him commercially. My grandfather was an advertising agency and small agent and small publisher, and he had done a bit of work. He had produced the Sinn Féin yearbook for Griffith a couple of times in the early 1900s. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I was asked to write an essay for a collection of essays, an essay about Griffith's journalism, that I really began to take an interest in the man and discover he was much more complex and much more interesting than I think he is remembered today. And in his own day, he was a very, very popular figure. Although nowadays we tend to talk a lot more about De Valera and Collins from that era. So I'm just going to put up a few slides I have here to help us as we go along. And are you seeing something on the screen now there? You should be, hopefully you've seen the screen. That's that okay?
We are indeed, Colum, yeah.
So my interest led on anyway to further research and to a biography of Griffith that I wrote that was published last year by Merriam Press. But in writing that, I also realized there was a lot about the treaty that isn't understood well. And I thought it would be a good idea maybe to follow up on it. And this year I've just had this book come out, Midnight in London, the Anglo-Irish Treaty Crisis, 1921, which focuses in particular on the dramatic events of the night of the 5th to the 6th of December, when eventually an agreement was signed in London. And you can see there on the front of the book the great picture of Griffith coming out with Collins after him, and then I think it's Barton out of 10 Downing Street to get into the car outside after one of the sessions of the peace conference. But I want to say too that, you know, I'm not here to argue one side or the other in a kind of Dev versus Griffith competition. It just doesn't interest me, to be honest. And I grew up in a household where my mother tended towards Dev, and my father was much more towards the other side. And I've supported neither party, particularly in my political leanings. I'm much more interested in what actually happened then and what it tells us about Ireland today and how Ireland has developed and how we can learn from it. So in a sense, you know, that is important to stress, because sometimes you find people are beating a drum for one side or the other. You know, I assume that all parties, Irish and British, acted in good faith, unless proven otherwise. They might not have acted wisely always, but I think most of them meant well. And I think, it's important to tell the Civil War fairly, because we're not free of it yet and its implications. And of course, what's happening now with Brexit in Northern Ireland, you know, we see echoes from the past 100 years later. So I'm not here to boost Griffith. I think he was quite a self-effacing man himself in many ways. Oh. Now, go back there. So when it comes to the treaty talks in London, many people, oddly enough, have the impression that Collins led the team. But, you know, Collins was definitely an exciting man. Neil Jordan has done him a service, of course, in the movie. He was a mythical figure, but in ways, this photograph was taken in Hans Place in London, which was the rented house, that one of the two rented houses that the Irish stayed in and did business in during the 2 months that they were negotiating the treaty in October to December 1921. And of course, you recognise there Griffith. As you're looking at the picture, Griffith on the left seated. The next person seated beside him is Duggan, another of the delegates, of the 5 delegates. Michael Collins, who was Minister for Finance, as well, of course, as a military leader, another of the delegates. Robert Barton, here on the right seated, was the 4th of the 5 delegates. The man standing behind is Gavin Duffy, the 5th delegate. And beside him, on the left, as we look at the photo, of course, Erskine Childers, who was a secretary to the delegation. And the other man is John Charteris, who was also a secretary to the delegation. A very devoted and able man who's really forgotten, actually, but did a lot of very good work for Ireland during those negotiations, you know. So neither Collins nor Griffith particularly wanted to go to London, but off they went loyally when asked by Dev, and Collins deferred to the leadership of Griffith. You know, Griffith was very much, as chairman, the man in charge, and there was no kind of question of that. Collins respected him. It's overwhelmingly clear, and you can see even here from the logistics of the picture that Griffith is leading them out. Griffith is a sort of invisible man of the period. We forget that he had been acting president of the Doyle by this stage for longer than De Valera had actually been president, because De Valera went off to America for most of the War of Independence from July 1919 till the end of 1920. And Griffith was his substitute in place of him until he was interned in November 1920. So he had a lot of experience and a lot of leadership skills, Griffith. But there you are, you walk into a shop and you'll see far more books about Collins and Dev than you'll see about Griffith himself. One of the things I'm trying to do in the new book is dispel some powerful myths about what happened then, and I'll come back to that in a little while. But first, can I just recap a little bit maybe on Arthur Griffith himself? His family background was Dublin, but with some Ulster blood from up around the border, Cavan Monaghan area. Perhaps some of it from perhaps some of his ancestors were Protestant. They seem to have been. That was a belief, although I'm not sure how much evidence there is of that. but he had an Ulster streak in him. But he was born in Dublin in 1871. And he was born into a family that wasn't well off at all. His father was a printer like himself, but his father wasn't a well man, and he was in declining health and died quite relatively young, leaving Griffith to look after his mother and also to help look after his siblings, his sister and one of his brothers. So they were always stuck for money. He was born in Upper Dominic Street, which is, very much in the centre of Dublin, at a time when central Dublin was one of the poorest places in Europe after Moscow, possibly the second poorest place in Europe after Moscow. And they lived then also in Summerhill, which is an even kind of more intensely central area of the city, very close to Monto, which was an area of prostitution. Now, people kind of sing the song, Take Me Up to Monto, and it's great crack, but Griffith knew it wasn't great crack for the women who worked there and who were, who were in a desperate condition. And he was always very conscious, Griffith, of the social and economic needs of ordinary working people. It was an important guiding factor in his life, and we need to remember that. He probably had more socioeconomic kind of consciousness than many of the other political nationalists at the time. He took his inspiration from Thomas Davis and John Mitchell, the more revolutionary side of the nationalist tradition, which is quite interesting, I think, because people often have a view that he was a moderate, but he was a moderate who was moderate by conviction, that he didn't want to use violence unless it was absolutely necessary, and because he believed violence tended to harm poorer people. But he was not against the use of revolutionary force for defense or even for liberation. And one of his mentors was the Fenian, the old Fenian John O'Leary, a very interesting man who lived in Dublin into very old age and took a great interest in young people. And they used to visit him a lot. Colum, the poet, was another person who used to go to John O'Leary. Yeats used to go there. They borrowed books from O'Leary and he'd give them advice. So that was a fascinating bridge into the earlier period, if you like. A lot of young men, like working men like Griffith, who didn't go to college, they joined, there were new active cultural and literary societies. It was kind of part of the Gaelic revival, but these were not like, in the Irish language, like the Celtic Literary Society. They would read books and they would argue about politics and literature. And they were very active and very, vivacious kind of organizations. But Griffith was finding it so hard that he decided to go to South Africa in 1897. There was a depression, there was a recession or depression, whatever you want to call it. So off he went to South Africa. He got a job as a clerk in a mining company. And he also got employed trying to run a very small newspaper, which didn't really work. But it was a great education for him in running a newspaper and in telling stories people wanted to read. Like, he just sense of what people really wanted. It was a good political education too, that he learned not to just write to please himself, but to write to kind of communicate with real people. And that he needed to leaven the politics with some sport and other forms of entertainment and so on in the paper. And this was to help him when he came back to Ireland, which he did in 1898. He returned because his friends had, with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they had persuaded the Irish Republican Brotherhood that Griffith could start a new newspaper for the nationalist movement that would be very useful. And that's how the United Irishman came into being. A paper that was, according to James Joyce at one point, his brother said, Joyce said it was the only paper in Dublin worth reading. And it's rich paper, deserves a book on its own. It's fascinating, all the people who wrote for the United Irishman. Yeats wrote for it, of course, but lots of other people like A.E. and Singh and a number of women writers, which in recent years has been noted by some feminist writers on the period. And Griffith was out agitating already with Maud Gonne and Yeats, who later would kind of get embarrassed by his earliest nationalist fervour, and James Connolly, the socialist, who was a friend of Griffith's. And they were out, in particular, protesting against the visit of Joseph Chamberlain during the Boer War. He came over Chamberlain to boost the English cause in the Boer War. And they went out, and when other people wouldn't, they went out and protested. The protest made its way, actually, into James Joyce's Ulysses at one point. So that's, if you like, up to 1900. And this is an important point, I think, with Griffith to remember. By 1900, Griffith had lived more than half his life. he was older than a lot of the other people who would be involved in the revolutionary movement later. And somebody described him as, at one stage as a Victorian man. And in many ways, his sensibilities were very much of that era and remained in that era in some ways. So in the early 20th century, he continues to edit advanced nationalist papers, a succession of them. And he really is a journalist and did enormous work. You were mentioning to me earlier the Bureau of Military History. If you read the accounts in the Bureau of Military History by the people who took part in 1916 in the War of Independence, again and again they refer to Griffith's papers as inspirational, as points, things that changed their mind. In 1904, he ran a series of articles in his papers called The Resurrection of Hungary, and he took the model of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had one king and two different parliaments in Austria and Hungary, and he put that forward as something that we should try to achieve in Ireland, to go back, if you like, to having our own parliament like we had before the Act of Union, but we would now have of course, the Catholics would now have a vote, not just the Protestants. And that series was really radical for its era. We forget this now. Some people have wrongly described Griffith as a monarchist because he wrote these articles. But in his day, it was more radical than Home Rule. And he was trying to be pragmatic and put forward something that might get some real support, because there was no chance a republic at that stage was going to be a runner politically. And it was so interesting to people that it was published, The Resurrection of Hungary, as a thick pamphlet. And it sold thousands and thousands, went into reprint a number of times, and was very influential. And Joyce was one of the ones, again, who read it and was influenced by it. And Joycean scholars in recent years only have begun to trace connections directly between Griffith's journalism and the Resurrection of Hungary on the one side, and a whole load of references in Joyce's work, like in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Then in 1905, of course, Griffith found Sinn Féin, and he found Sinn Féin yearbook, and lots of information in the yearbook, which was intended to help to build up Irish industry. It was the equivalent of a database now. There were no such things. Irish industry was very rudimentary. They'd only started to have these kind of information books that could be relied on by people looking for business and trying to do business. And he also founded a cooperative bank, because a lot of the banks were very much not inclined to give startup money to small business. And he put off his wedding for a long time because of his commitment to his work and his poverty. But in 1910, he married a member of the Sheehan family. A nice photograph of her here. She was called Maud, although that wasn't always on her birth cert. It was Mary. She didn't like the name. And Griffith always called her Molly. She was always known to him as Molly. As I say, he influenced James Joyce, and Joyce was grateful to him for publishing a letter of protest about his difficulties in finding a publisher for Dubliners. And Griffith was the only editor in Ireland who dared to publish the full letter. And he gave Joyce advice too, for which Joyce was very grateful. In 1916, he wasn't out. They didn't want him to go out. He'd been involved in planning in some very important senior planning meetings in 1914, at which all the signatories were in attendance. But they wanted him to remain where he was for propaganda purposes. He was also older, and he had really poor eyesight. He could hardly recognize people till they were very close to him. So he actually wouldn't have made much of a volunteer, to be honest, if he had to fight. After 1916, of course, the more militant people wanted De Valera to come in and take over Sinn Féin. De Valera had never been a fan of Sinn Féin. He'd never joined it, I think. He had a bee in his bonnet about it. He blamed it wrongly, according to all the biographers, for having stopped and getting some kind of a senior position in an Irish language organization. But he didn't take to the organization. Then he becomes, of course, president of it in 1917, and Griffith takes a back seat as deputy president. But he's also then acting president of the Doyle, as I say, when Dev goes away. And in 1921, he becomes chairman of the treaty delegates. De Valera goes over in July, meets Lloyd George on his own 4 times to set up talks, but then won't go to the talks, sends Griffith instead. And then, of course, Griffith collapses and dies on the 12th of August 1922 during the Civil War. So that's Griffith, a very fascinating and complex individual. This was a house his supporters bought him when he did get married in 1910. And I think it's shocking that this was on the market 2 years ago and the government didn't buy it or some public body didn't buy it. Believe it or not, this little house in St. Lawrence's Road in Clontarf is at that stage divided into 7 one-bedroom bed sits, believe it or not, yielding an annual revenue of €68,000. I mean, the mind boggles, but it should have been bought. It isn't. There's a little plaque on the wall that was put up by some admirers years ago that's falling apart. But it was bought by a group of about 250 people kicked in to get the money together to buy it from, including Roger Casement, Constance Markovitch, Sean T. O'Kelly, Bethel Solomons, the Jewish obstetrician that was a friend of his, Douglas Hyde, all kinds of really interesting people. My grandfather was there too as one of them. And they bought this. They were terrified Griffith was going to sell it and use the money for Sinn Féin because he always poured his money into the organisation. But anyway, he stayed there till the end and it was frequently raided by the Black and Tan. The picture here shows him released from prison in 1920, walking up to the front door with her 2 children, his daughter Rita and his son Nevin. So I think it's quite nice. There are the papers he edited successively. The United Irishmen, founded in 1899, which was closed down after a defamation action by a priest in County Limerick who didn't like what Griffith wrote about him. He was quite, unlike Dev, he wasn't afraid to take a swing at a clergyman when he wanted to, if he thought they weren't behaving in the way he liked. So when it closed down, he called his next paper Sinn Féin, the same name as the movement he founded. That was ultimately suppressed by the British Army. And then he played a game of cat and mouse with other papers, Scissors and Paste in Ireland and Nationality. But now they are luckily, just in the recent times, have been digitized. The Irish Radical Newspaper Archive, which is it's affiliated to the Irish Newspaper Archive, although I think it's an extra subscription, unfortunately. So not all libraries can afford it, but it's terrific that it's been digitized at last. Some of these small papers, the mosquito press they used to be called sometimes, because they used to buzz around and irritate the British powers that be, and indeed other vested interests that weren't British in Ireland. He was again an interesting man. His pastimes, he loved swimming. He swam nearly every day, winter and summer in Dublin Bay. He used to play a lot of chess. One of his chess partners was Abraham Briscoe, the head of the future Lord Mayor of Dublin, Robert Briscoe. They used to play in the DBC Bakery in O'Connell Street till it was destroyed in 1916. He loved collecting music. He had a great repertoire. He used to sing himself of ballads and opera arias, believe it or not. And one of his favourite haunts was this old pub on Patrick Street in Dublin, McCall's, where James Clarence Mangan used to drink. And they still had the table where Clarence Mangan used to sit, and Griffith used to sit there too. The McCalls were interesting themselves. For about 30 years, they produced Old Moore's Almanac, which is still going, of course, now. So he had a great humanity in him, which wasn't often seen by people who weren't close to him. And some people have described him as humorless. He wasn't at all humorless. He loved going out with friends. He used to go for long walks and cycles in the Dublin mountains. And he'd like to take a drink in McCall's, a pint of Guinness or a glass of Guinness, and in the Bailey off Grafton Street, or in the Ship in Abbey Street. So, he was quite a sociable individual. Now, his career in the Doyle, this is an interesting photograph. You often see it wrongly captioned as the Doyle when it first met in January 1921. Well, if you know much about Irish history, you'll realise that can't be January 1921 because, I misstated that underneath that myself. Now I'm talking about a wrong caption. That should be April 1919. That photograph is, but you often see it as January 1919. But of course, in January, Griffith and Dev and a lot of the others here were still interned in jail, and Cathal Brugha was the temporary president. But in April 1919, this picture is taken of the first Doyle. And he's playing a very active role in this. And it's important to remember that Doyle was very active. We're very fond of concentrating on the exciting military stuff. And a lot of the TV stuff has been about action movie, when the British were shot at or they shot at us. But there was an awful lot of hard, solid work being done by the Doyle to set up an alternative state with county council systems and its own police and court system. And finance being raised, and all that work was being done, and it doesn't get enough attention at all, and it was important work. This is a great picture. it's a detailed, these old glass plates that you get in the Lawrence collection, they're fantastic technology. You can zoom right in on them. For a lot of the 20th century, photography was made up of little dots. And if you tried to zoom in on a picture, you lost focus completely. You couldn't see very much. But they were like digital images almost, the old glass plates. And this is one from the National Library, and it shows the whole interior of the Mansion House in full during a Doyle session. But you can go in and go in and go in until you see here what you're looking at. There's Griffith in the middle, sitting on the couch. And on his left, reading a paper in the armchair, is Dev. And standing up beside him, talking to the Doyle with the paper behind his back, is Michael Collins. And Collins is looking up at Owen MacNeill sitting in the chair, the Ceann Comhairle. It's fantastic stuff. And a lot of the public are in at this session too. They couldn't let in. There were so many people, they had to turn people away. So it's a great photograph. But you can go to the National Library website and you can look at these photographs and blow them up. And they're just a great resource. And I'd never seen that one published that detailed before, until I published it myself recently in an article in the Sunday Independent. So, hang on. Now, this is a photograph of Griffith and Dev, but they had a strange relationship. You know, they were very supportive of one another for a long time. And Griffith remained very supportive of Dev to the bitter end. A French newspaper journalist who interviewed Griffith referred to him and Dev as Sancho Panza and Don Quixote. And I think it's a great simile, because, you know, you had Dev, the charging knight, on very quixotic, is, you know, full of principle and, you know, maybe not very practical. And down to earth Griffith, who was a real pragmatist, who always, you know, had quite a low profile, and was a kind of Sancho Panza figure to De Valera. And such a tragedy, you know, what was to happen later. I suppose one of the mysteries is why Dev didn't go back to London in 1921 for the treaty talks. This portrait of him was painted by John Lavery in July, when Dev went over a few days after the truce and met Lloyd George. And it was a funny visit, because Dev brought Griffith with him. He made Collins stay at home. Collins was quite annoyed about that. They brought Barton and Griffith and a few others, but they didn't get to meet Lloyd George. He met them on his own. I mean, later there would be criticism of Griffith and Collins for meeting the British sometimes on their own. But Dev, the only meetings Dev had with Lloyd George, he was on his own the whole time. And, you know, I think he got a pretty good idea of what was coming down the track. So the British were never going to allow a republic. But I don't know why he didn't go back. There were lots of theories, and he himself gave different reasons, you know, that he wanted to hold himself back as a symbol of the republic, that the others could weaken the British, and then suddenly the thing would be nearly closing down, and he could come in at that stage like a knight in shining armor, and he would be able to extract more concessions from the British. It was a pretty schoolboyish approach, I think, to negotiations, but that was one of the reasons he gave. Another was that he didn't, you know, maybe he shouldn't be out of Ireland because, you know, the extremists who were left behind, like Austin Stack and Cathal Brugha, who had refused to go to London. But anyhow, we have the treaty negotiations themselves, and I'm going to talk about 5 myths or 6 myths that I think have grown up. If you're talking a pub with people, or you just talk in the street, people have all kinds of ideas. One of the ideas is that Collins led the team, and I wouldn't blame people for thinking that, because I've watched a couple of documentaries myself on TV in the last couple of years, and Griffith literally barely gets a mention. And it's all Collins, as if Collins went over to spite Dev, you know. Collins and Griffith would later have disagreements in the run-up to the Civil War, but at this stage, Collins was totally on side and comfortable with Griffith as chairman, and respected him. There was no problem, and you know, there was no question. But the chairman was Griffith, and was solidly in charge. Now they're the delegates. The funny thing about this, you had Griffith, a down-to-earth Dubliner working printer, and you had Collins, and you had Duggan, who was director of intelligence at the IRA during the War of Independence. He was a solicitor's clerk who became a solicitor late in life. So here you had the people you might expect would be the most resistant to compromise, but they were the ones who were prepared to compromise and do a deal. Whereas the two people that held out longest were the most privileged. You had Barton, who came, an agriculturist who came from a wealthy family in Wicklow that had 1,500 acres, plus money from the Barton and Gustier vineyards in France. And you had Gavin Duffy, who had grown up in a villa in the south of France. His father was a judge in Australia. He'd gone to a private Jesuit boarding school in London, in England, and become a solicitor in London. He was on the defence team for Roger Casement, and it was only after the Casement trial he comes to Ireland. Yet those two were the people who were holding out, if you like, the hardest line to the end before they all agreed in the end to sign it. So I think that's a paradox in some ways. And I think it's interesting and should be discussed further because I think it says something about the practicalities of the situation. Delegates had been ratified by the Doyle. They were the Doyle's delegate, not the government's delegates, not De Valera's delegates. Dev did try to give them instructions. They're often referred to as instructions that they were given before they left. But if you read them, you'll see that they're actually requests because De Valera didn't have the constitutional power in the Doyle to give them instructions when they were the Doyle's plenipotentiaries. We know, of course, the word plenipotentiary means it comes from two Latin words, plena, meaning full, and potens or potentiaria, whatever, my Latin, which means power. So they had full power. They were given credentials, and there's a story attached to this. This is very important, the wording, because it was part of the game that was played. They were given, in virtue of the authority vested in me by the Doyle, wrote, I hereby appoint the 5 lads as envoys plenipotentiary from the elected government of the Republic of Ireland to negotiate. Now, that's like a red rag to a bull. You see, the British had a problem. Dev was kind of playing games here. If the British accepted those credentials, Dev would say, well, they've accepted that the government of Ireland, that there is a government in the Republic of Ireland, the Doyle represents it, and these represent the government. But of course, the British were not prepared to accept yet either that there was a legitimate government and certainly not that it was a republic. So these credentials were never formally presented in the end. And there was a lot of this kind of stuff was going on where each side was kind of using words. And again, it's a bit debating society-ish. Because in the end of the day, really what mattered was the hard politics, what would be agreed on the ground, not the words. Ultimately, what mattered was what was going to happen in the document agreed at the end, and not what was said in the run-up to it. The second myth is that somehow the treaty created partition, as if somehow that was part of the deal, that it made partition. But of course, the British had partitioned Ireland in 1920 under the UK Government of Ireland Act. And they had set up Parliament in Belfast, and that Parliament had already been opened and met. So it was a fait accompli, the partition of Ireland. And what was happening in London was actually the delegates trying to see if they could adjust it somewhat, that it would be a better kind of partition, if you like, if Ireland had to be partitioned than the one that had been set up under the Government of Ireland Act. And this is an amazing quotation, I think, because, you know, the people who think partition didn't exist by the time the delegates went to London, just look at this, what Dev told the Doyle earlier in that autumn. He said if the Republic were recognised, he'd be in favour of giving each county power to vote itself out of the Republic if it so wished. Otherwise, they, meaning the Sinn Féin, would be compelled to use force. And they hadn't got the power, and some of them hadn't got the inclination to use force with Ulster. He didn't think the policy would be successful. They'd be making the same mistake with that section as England had made with Ireland. And he wouldn't be responsible for such a policy. Ulster's present position was that she claimed the 6 counties as a constitutional right given to her constitutionally through the realm, and didn't want to be under the domination of the rest of Ireland, whose sentiments, ideals, and religions were different. Now that's from the official Doyle record, and that's Dev, months before the treaty people even get to London. He's accepting that, you know, basically there will be a partition. What was to happen in London was they would discuss whether Tyrone and Fermanagh might become part of the Free State rather than remain with the other counties. So there's the map, of course. We all know it too well now. Northern Ireland created in 1920, the Irish Free State, which would be created in 1922. This is the myth that Griffith somehow made startling and secret concessions in early November. As Frank Pakenham put it in his very influential book, Peace by Ordeal, which is an account of the treaty published in 1935, very plausible and in some ways quite good book, but he relied for his account largely on an interview with Austin Chamberlain, the leader of the Tory party, who was one of the British negotiators. And Chamberlain wouldn't even show him the notes that he was relying on. And a lot of times you read about how Griffith signed something or wrote a letter or assented to proposals that the British made to him in early November about the border and the boundary commission. It's simply, they're inaccurate, frankly. And I've actually found, and this is one of the reasons I published this the new little book, Midnight in London. I found the document that they talk about and that they say was signed by him, and it isn't signed by him. It was shown to him, and a note at the end is by the British Cabinet Secretary saying it was shown to him, and he didn't sign it. He refused to sign it, even though Colin Murphy's new play, The Treaty, shows the actor who plays Griffith signing. The evidence is quite clear that he refused to endorse the idea until he heard back from what the Ulster unionists, and he refused to bind his team and said he couldn't and wouldn't bind, and they'd all have to discuss it and decide what would be done about it. And why this is important is this is the text that Lloyd George produced on the last night of the treaty debates, of the treaty negotiations, and threw on the table and claimed that Griffith had given him assurances about it. And it has been used ever since to discredit Griffith and to make the team in London look weak. And frankly, I think that it was a bit of black propaganda on the British side. That's my own view of it. And that Irish historians have fallen into the trap, partly because Griffith makes a handy scapegoat for everybody not getting exactly what they wanted in 1921 once he died. And I go into the details of that document and reproduce it in my latest book. And I'm hoping that it will loosen the grip that Pakenham's book has on our understanding of what actually happened in London, which was much different, because the actual evidence shows Griffith keeping De Valera briefed the whole time about what was going on and saying that he was refusing to consent to what they were proposing. And in fact, what they were proposing later becomes part of a full document that goes to the whole Irish cabinet, who were fully aware of the proposals before the agreement was finally signed in London. The fourth myth is that the treaty has a note of allegiance to the king. It doesn't. It was taken out at the end. What you're looking at there underneath is Article 4 of the treaty, as the agreement was signed. The oath is to be taken by members of the Parliament of the Irish Free State is as follows. I will say, John Murphy, to solemnly swear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the Irish Free State as by law established. And it goes on to say, and I will be faithful to King George V, his heirs and successors by law, in virtue of the common citizenship of Ireland and Britain and our adherence to and membership of the group of nations forming the British Commonwealth of Nations. Now, whether you think there's much difference between an oath of allegiance and an oath of faithfulness is a matter of opinion, and it would be argued at length in the treaty debates in the Doyle, but it's certainly not the same thing. And for people to continually say there was an oath of allegiance to the king, I think is weaponizing history. You have to be careful about these things, because certainly the team in London thought it was a significant difference. And they also managed to get the word Commonwealth into this document. It's the first use of the word Commonwealth in an official British document. And it signifies a changing nature of the empire itself, which had Australia and Canada in it, into a much looser arrangement than what the old empire meant. And it's a significant word for them to get put in here, because if Ireland was to remain, which it was, in the empire with the king as its head of state for a number of years, the point would be that they could have a massive amount of freedom within that, which wasn't what was associated with the idea of the old empire. The fifth myth is that they signed the treaty. They didn't sign the treaty. They signed a conditional document called Articles of Agreement. They were assigning an agreement for a treaty, and it was conditional totally on approval by Doyle Aaron. And again, this is a very important point. Dev afterwards was complaining they hadn't come back to him before the end, that they had undertaken to do so. and that's a matter of debate. But the fact of the matter was they couldn't come back because Lloyd George gave them an ultimatum. He said, if you walk out, it's all over and war begins tomorrow. So they had been back in Dublin on the Saturday before the treaty was the agreement for the treaty was signed. They'd come back to a full cabinet meeting. Everybody knew what was going on. And in London, then on the Monday and Tuesday, they were given the ultimatum, and they all decided, all five of them, that unpleasant as it was to get an ultimatum, they were not going to walk out and launch Ireland back into war when they had the option of going back to Dublin and letting the Doyle make up its mind. And the Doyle was completely free to reject the treaty. But what happens, of course, they go back to Dublin, and much to De Valera's surprise, there's only 7 people in the cabinet, himself, Austin Stack, and Cathal Brewer, the hardliners, if you like, Barton, Collins, and Griffith, who have now decided to propose the Doyle the treaty, and Cosgrave, who'd been kind of sitting on the fence. And Cosgrave surprises Deb by coming down on the side of Griffith and saying the Doyle should decide. And then we know what happens next. But that there on your screen is the actual top of the agreement that was signed. And strangely enough, the document signed at 2:20 in the morning on the morning of the 6th of December, nowhere contained the word treaty. The Irish request the next day of the British cabinet will add the word treaty. And at a cabinet meeting held at midday at midday on the day that the treaty had been signed after midnight, this is our item 7 on the minutes of the British cabinet. Cabinet were informed that the Irish representatives were anxious that the articles of agreement should bear the word treaty in the heading. The cabinet agreed. I've never seen that discussed. Now, maybe it has been, but I never noticed it or understood. I don't know why that happened, why the word treaty wasn't in there, and why the Irish were so anxious to get it put in there. But as I say, they came back to Dublin. Another mystery why they didn't phone Dev that night. Well, Dev had kind of made himself scarce. He'd been annoyed to be summoned back to Dublin by Griffith's request for a cabinet meeting on the Saturday. He was over in the west of Ireland giving pep talks to volunteers and lecturing them on the evils of alcohol. And he'd gone back as soon as the cabinet meeting ended. And nobody's quite sure whether that was deliberately to keep out of the way. But they didn't even try to ring him, apparently. Now, the phones, of course, weren't very reliable in those days, and they were also very subject to eavesdropping. To such an extent, I found this amazing, that the Cabinet Secretary, Thomas Jones, in his diary, talks about speaking Welsh. He was Welsh and so was Lloyd George. They used to speak Welsh to one another on the phone. Now, who on earth did they feel was tapping the telephone of the British Prime Minister? Well, whoever might be doing that would certainly have no difficulty tapping the phone line from London to Dublin, that's for sure. So I'm coming to the end now, but I just want to show you a few quick photos before I do. I like this one, Hans Place, the house they stayed in. Molly goes over to join Arthur at the end. That photograph, I think, is taken in the doorway there of Hans Place. And what they're looking out on is this picture on the left. It's Hans Place itself. And you'll see in the railings of the little park, there's a monument with a broken pillar, which is a broken column, which is a signifier of a life cut short. And this is a monument to a British officer who died in the wars in Africa in the 1800s. And I sometimes wonder when I've seen Griffith's monument in Glasnevin, which is the little insert photograph that his wife got made, and it's a broken column, as you see there. And I really wondered, did she have a conversation that day the photograph was taken about the column in Hans Place? And he would have explained to her, because he was so interested in history, probably what that signified. And did she think, well, this is a great idea for Griffith's monument? She was bitter that the state didn't do more to commemorate him. She wanted a big plot for him, like Parnell's in Glasnevin, and the state thought that was too much. And so there was a lot of toing and froing. She wasn't a happy woman about Griffith's fate. She felt he'd given his life for everybody else, and they were advancing, and left him taking the brunt of being blamed for lots of things and having done all the hard work. And she turned fairly bitter about that, to be honest. The Doyle in January, of course, votes 64 to 57 to accept the treaty. I like this picture very much. Arthur Griffith liked to walk everywhere, but sometimes took a horse. And there's a great quotation. If you could write history in terms of vehicles, this is from the Cork Examiner describing four main characters going to the treaty debates in Dublin. Mr. De Valera drove up in a somewhat old-fashioned car, perfect for Dev. Michael Collins lolls back in a Rolls Royce, wherever he got that. They had used rented Rolls Royces in London to bring them to the talks in Downing Street, I suppose because they thought it looked the part. They wanted to look like a government. Arthur Griffith balanced himself on the side of a jaunty car. And of course, Carl Brewer laboriously pedalled along on a bicycle. I just really like that image of them all. It fits their political persona and personalities in so many ways. This picture is my favorite photograph of Arthur Griffith. I found this New York Times supplement in a bookshop in Maine in the United States. I'd never seen the photograph anywhere. And it's published in January 1922, celebrating Arthur Griffith as head of state when he had become president of Doyle and when De Valera resigned. And in it, he looks healthy. He looks, energetic, and he looks quite good-humored. And I think it's a very nice photograph of him. This is probably my least favorite photograph that you often see. He looks ill. It looks stilted and posed. He's at his desk as if the photographer said, "Look around here, Arthur." But why I have it here at the desk is because I wanted to show you this little scrap I found among the Griffith papers in the National Library of Ireland. There's not much in there. A lot of Griffith papers were lost. They got rid of a lot themselves, himself and Molly, because they were afraid in all the raids that took place that the Tans or the army would get compromising material about other people. And after his death, his widow told Pádraig Colum later that she destroyed letters. She said she didn't want anybody reading Arthur's correspondence with her. So there's not a lot of Arthur Griffith correspondence, but in the boxes that they have, this anonymous note. And I just like it because, I think it represents what people thought had happened to Arthur Griffith in reality, whatever the medical condition was that caused him to collapse. It said Arthur Griffith died of a broken heart. Shortly after the start of the Civil War, workmen were delayed in getting into his office as he was seated at his desk with his hands to his face. On arranging his desk for removal, one of the workmen discovered the blotting pad was quite wet with his tears. And of course, in the end, he was ill and he went into Vincent's nursing home on Leeson Street and he collapses and dies. And that was the end of Arthur Griffith. Was he a hero? Well, heroes have clay feet. I think there's good and bad in everybody. He was an interesting man. Here's a photograph that I found in the National Library that didn't identify Arthur Griffith in it. But when you look close, you see him there on the day of the whole gun running. And he has his rifle that he got that day. He wasn't a pacifist. He was prepared, as I said, there's lots of evidence during the War of Independence when he was acting president of the Doyle, he was sanctioning certain operations, but he didn't use it lightly. He'd been taught that by O'Leary and he believed it himself. And one of the reasons he didn't much like Jim Larkin because he thought he was a stunt man who was prepared to organize things with the workers and maybe leave them in the lurch. James Connolly, the socialist, always called Griffith his friend, but he didn't like Larkin. And because of that, sometimes he's said to be anti-socialist. He certainly wasn't a socialist. He was mainstream in his views, like most Irish people. I mean, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael are not socialist, and the main political groupings in Ireland are not socialist. So you might want him to be socialist if you're a socialist, but he was what he was. The young man beside him, by the way, in that photograph on our left, as you're looking for it, I think is Pádraig Colum, the poet who shortly afterwards went to the United States and who was there that day and wrote about it later. And it was the last time he'd see Griffith alive. He could be irascible to work with. He published some anti-Semitic material in his early papers, although he matured from that and grew out of it. That's seldom mentioned. And there was plenty of it about, which is also seldom mentioned. He became a bit of a scapegoat for anti-Semitism. He could have a sharp tongue. Maybe he was too trusting of Lloyd George. It's hard to say. He went to do it. They had to do a deal. You don't go. They were never going to get over cups of tea in London what people had not got through the War of Independence. They went to do a deal, and in all deals, you have to do compromises. And the British compromise was pretty enormous. I mean, the British Army was about to leave 26 of the 32 counties of Ireland for the first time in hundreds of years. And we had full fiscal and economic autonomy, which Griffith had really fought for, and which is seldom mentioned. because we're so in love, like with political tradition here and political issues, we sometimes forget the economic and social aspects. So, and they've got the Boundary Commission, which at that stage looked like it would deliver at least 2 of the 6 counties into the Free State. And why that didn't happen is a long story I'm not going to go into here, but it certainly wasn't helped by the Civil War, by the Irish fighting among themselves. They didn't tie down the Boundary Commission enough, but that wasn't particularly Griffith's fault. They were all to blame for that. There were too many loopholes, and there are echoes of what happened in relation to the Boundary Commission and British goodwill. On that occasion, there are definitely echoes in relation to the protocol and Brexit today. No two ways about it. Once bitten shame on you, twice bitten shame on me. He could have pushed harder on the oath. I mean, even as it remained, it would stick in my gullet and it stuck in most people's gullets, but it was part of the compromise. And maybe later on, could he have not shelled the forecourts? And that again, you can debate that one forever. He felt, they had to assert themselves, or the British would have come back in, rightly or wrongly. He felt there was a government now and it had a democratic mandate. And unfortunately, there were some people who weren't accepting that. But if you had a government, you had to act like a government. And that was his view. And you can agree with it or not. I'm not claiming Griffith was perfect. He could be irascible. Well, so could a lot of other people. With a lot of anti-Semitism about. He had a sharp editorial tongue, which actually the 1960s leaders admired him for and wanted him to continue using. Hard to know if he was too trusting of Lloyd George. True that the Boundary Commission position was not tied down, and possibly didn't push hard enough on the oath. I'll leave it up to you to judge whether he should have or could have prevented the shelling of the forecourts. If he had, would it have solved matters? Would it have to have happened sooner or later that they took on the irregulars? And should he have said on the last night that he was personally going to sign even if the others didn't? Hard to know why he did that. Was he playing for time? He wasn't binding the others. They could still have refused to sign. Was he trying to make it more complicated so the British wouldn't immediately go to war if people walked out? Or had he just felt that they had to get on with it and they'd reached a point where they weren't going to get anything more and they might as well go ahead and sign and bring it back and let the Doyle decide? This is the man who Harry Boland, who was on the other side of the Civil War, is reported to have said to a friend, "Damn it, Pat, he made us all." And Michael Collins is reported to have described him as father of us all. And yet he has been quite forgotten too often, and I think deserves a lot more attention. There's a lot to be learned from what he did and how he handled things, about how we might take forward negotiations now in respect to the north of Ireland. We can't lay down the law. We shouldn't lay down the law. We should learn from what happened. And there's a lot to learn when you look at Griffith. So thank you very much for your patience.
Colum, that was really interesting. I will open it up to the floor if anybody has any questions. What I'll just do at the moment is allow you to unmute your mics. And if anybody has a question and would like to share it with the group, please do so. David, how are you doing? I see you waving there at me. Do you want to have a question?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great, David. Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. I was wondering how much Lloyd George managed to manipulate Griffith. Was the threat of war the following day or the following morning just a bluff?
Well, I'll take the second part of that question first. We'll never know if it was a bluff. The 5 delegates in London believed it wasn't. And I suppose the significant thing is, if you had been there and you had the choice between if you were there and you had the choice of sending it back to Dublin, in other words, signing the agreement for a treaty, letting the Doyle decide, or chancing, taking a chance or a gamble on peace in Ireland and walking out the door, it'd be very hard, I think, to have walked out the door and made that decision, particularly when you think, the De Valera hadn't joined them. And even Barton, who was sympathetic to Dev staying in Dublin originally, Barton in the end was pleading with De Valera to come to London. So, I mean, they were a bit irked by that. They felt, why should we decide? And although there were differences between them, I think it's very understandable, let's say, whether Lloyd George was bluffing or not. And, you know, there's a lot of reason to think he wasn't, you know, bluffing either, but we'll never know. And the first question was did he outsmart? He was a very clever politician, but I think the Welsh wizard thing is overdone, his nickname, you know. I mean, he was a man with his own problems. He was a prime minister, but he was head of the smaller party in a coalition government that was very unstable. And, yeah, the Liberals and the Tories, and they had their own backbenchers, the diehards who were unionists and very bloody minded. And you also had very high unemployment in Britain after the war. And you had a lot of people who felt they were talking to terrorists in Downing Street, and this was appalling to have invited them into Downing Street. So we forget that side of it too sometimes. I think he was just a politician who was trying to square the circle and get, you know, and he was prepared to make concessions. But I think the difference was the British made the concessions at the start when they said Ireland could become a dominion like Canada and Australia, and it would give it a lot of economic freedom. And they were the main British concessions, whereas the main Irish concessions, if you like, didn't come to the very end when they conceded that this would probably be the best way forward or a stepping stone. So I think the sinister Lloyd George thing, I think, is overdone. A lot of historians would disagree with me, you know.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks a million, David. Thanks, Colum. Have we any other questions from the group? If you want to give a little wave there into your camera, you can.
Yeah, I'm just listening.
Hello, Stephen. How are you doing? Yeah. I was wondering myself, Colum, Ulster had such a great influence on the debates, and they weren't there. Did you have any thoughts on that in terms of, you know, they kept having to refer back to seeing what the Craig answer was? Did you think they should have been there, or?
Yeah, well,
I leaned on something.
I think somebody there is talking. Sorry. Yeah, well, I mean, De Valera said in the first place it should be between Dublin and London, that Ulster shouldn't be at the table. That, you know, and then that was a fair enough point in a way. You know, it really, that was correct, but I think they needed to be brought in at some stage. And this brings me back to that. It's hard to talk about that whole issue, you know, what Griffith did or didn't dissent or sign or didn't sign, because doesn't lend itself to kind of a lecture. You have to kind of read it. But the one thing that is clear is that Griffith was saying he wasn't prepared to make a decision until Craig came back with their position, their commitment on the border. He wanted to know what they were prepared to buy into. And I think that was very wise, because part of the problem later was Ulster wasn't attached to what happened over the border. And right to the very end, on the last night, Griffith is pleading for Lloyd George to tell him, you know, to get a response from Ulster, from Craig, before they would make their minds up about anything. So I think your point is very valid. But there is another strange side to this. When you read the Doyle Debates, it's a fantastic volume. They're all online now, you know, the treaty debates. Some of them were private at the time and some were public, but they're all published now, and you can read them online free, or you can get in book form. They hardly talk about partition of the border. It wasn't an issue. It was as if suddenly they had parked it. And the debate is swirling around much more about the king being, you know, still head of state, the empire status, all the Jesuitical distinctions about whether we could have external association, what might be, you know, what would be in the empire and what wouldn't be out. And the oath, of course, there was a lot of resistance to that. And to some extent, the treaty ports, which in fact turned out to be not contentious at all in reality. But the number of speeches about partition in Ulster were minimal. And I mean, some Northerners, I think, were a bit aggrieved about that because they felt they were being abandoned and that it wasn't really an issue. But perhaps everybody at that stage still thought that the Boundary Commission, you know, simply had to deliver nationalist areas, most nationalist areas to the south. The Boundary Commission was modelled on a provision in the Treaty of Versailles that was being used to redraw the border between Germany and Silesia. And it was beginning to operate just at the time that the treaty negotiations were taking place. So there was a precedent for it. And that made it all the more likely, I think, in people's minds that it would go ahead and that it would redraw the border. But as we know, in the end, for one reason or another, it was a dead letter. Nothing ever happened and the border never changed.
Thanks, Colum. Folks, would anybody else have any comment, or are you happy enough?
Adele.
Hello, Annie May. How are you?
And no, it's me. I don't know there was a Dermot. I know he kind of lost it there, but he just wants to ask a question. He's really linked into it. Is that okay?
That's great. Yeah.
Dr. McLaughlin. Yeah, that's okay. No.
Yeah, thank you.
Ask your question. Yeah. Thanks very much, Adele.
Thank you, Adele.
No problem, Dermot. Yeah, you ask your question there.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question. First of all, the context of the time of the treaty, it didn't bring that into the discussion. I mean, things are very serious for the British if they fail to get an agreement. They were under fierce pressure to have an agreement with the way the war was going here. And the second thing is there was a commitment given that they'd come back before they'd sign. Is that true or false? That they were told to come back before they'd sign anything?
The official, yeah, well, you're referring to...
They signed that at 2:30 in the morning under duress. That would be a terrible war if they didn't. They're the two questions.
Yeah. Well, so certainly the British had international pressure to come to an arrangement. There's no two ways about that. And that would have probably moderated any action they could have taken. I mean, Collins and Mulcahy were afraid that the volunteers hadn't got the wherewithal to continue the War of Independence, and they knew that the British could, if they wanted to, pour in a lot more troops than before, because the war in Europe was over and they wouldn't have to rely on ragtags like the Black and Tans. But as you say, on the other hand, the British were under international pressure. And, there was this whole dance taking place that if the Stokes were going to break down, the Irish would engineer it that they would break down over Ulster, because as Lloyd George admitted, not too many people in Britain were going to be willing to die for Tyrone and Fermanagh. But the British were trying to engineer it to break down over the head of state business, because they felt that if the Irish went back to war simply on the grounds that they weren't prepared to accept the king as head of state like Australia or Canada, that the Irish would lose international sympathy. So the international dimension was certainly important, and that's an issue. Now, as regards the so-called undertakings and so on, we have to be very careful. The document, the official minutes of the cabinet meeting in Dublin on the Saturday before the treaty was signed are appalling. There's very little in them. And it was said afterwards nobody could agree what was agreed at that meeting, and the minutes are not very helpful. And Cathal Brugha later made assertions of what had happened there, which sometimes get mixed up with what actually happened. Yes, certainly. Of course, Cathal Brugha and Austin Stack and Dev would have liked them to have come back, and not to sign. But the reality was, whatever way you look at it, on the night that was in it, they had to make a decision. Either they were going to come back, in which case, if Lloyd George wasn't bluffing, there was nothing to discuss because it was over and there was war, or else they would sign the agreement for a treaty, which was conditional.
But if you look, sorry, just excuse me, if you look at when we joined the EEC in 1971 or 2, Paddy Hillary did all the negotiations, but he came back every time when he gave away the fishing rights. He came back to see what would it be accepted.
Well, the agreement was brought back, and the Doyle did debate it. I mean, whether it was brought back before they signed
it had been signed, though. It had been signed, to see.
Well, what was signed was an agreement for a treaty, not the treaty. It was an agreement for a treaty. There wasn't a treaty until the Doyle approved the agreement and later ratified it. So they had the full power.
That's kind of mixing words. That's kind of mixing words, really.
Well,
they signed a document. They signed a document of agreement.
It didn't bind Ireland, though, the document of agreement. It only bound them to propose it to the Doyle. And that's a very important distinction, I think. Now you could say, what's the choice? Should they have walked out and left and chanced it? I'm not sure. Maybe they should have, but they had been back. There was a mad cabinet meeting on the Saturday before the treaty debate started in Dublin.
And two of them voted against it when they came back. Two of them felt they were wrong to sign it and voted against it.
I think they all voted for it in the Doyle on the first occasion, if I'm not mistaken. They later changed their views on the issue. Barton became a supporter of De Valera, and Gavin Duffy kind of drifted away, but they all they all came back and said that they thought they had done the right thing and that they had to do it, even though it was under duress. But of course, the Irish had been applying their own duress. The Irish had been threatening war too. They'd been threatening to revert to the War of Independence all along. And that's the kind of game you get at negotiations. It wasn't pleasant, that's for sure. Nobody liked it. And Griffith pleaded 4 times with Lloyd George to let them come back to Dublin without signing. But he just said, this is it. You're plenipotentiaries and you have the right to sign it. And if you don't all sign it, it's war. So maybe
thanks very much.
Maybe
Thanks
they were wrong.
much.
I mean, maybe they're wrong. I'm not saying, if you think they were wrong, you're wrong. Of course, you're entitled to your view. But I do think it's important that we remember that what they signed didn't bind anybody and was conditional on the Dáil's approval.
But if it was rejected when they came back, what would have happened?
Well, good question. I suppose either the British would have gone to war or talks would have had to resume again. And it's a bit of a mystery, actually. That wasn't well explored. I mean, that's a very interesting question. And there never seemed to really be, in the end. I mean, there was a vote, all right, and it came close, but nobody ever really seems to have thought terribly seriously about what was going to happen. The country could have been plunged into war again, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
But they would hardly ever have. I don't think there was the wherewithal, for instance, to have a united Ireland. I don't think Ulster could have been defeated. Britain certainly would not have allowed that to happen, whatever else. And the Ulster volunteers were heavily armed. So I couldn't see a situation where the 26 counties would have taken over the 6 counties under any circumstances.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Than't you very much.
Thanks, Dermot. Thanks, Colum.
It's good to have.
Thanks, Edel.
I'm glad. It's good to. I mean, as I say, I'm not here to beat a drum for either side, and they're good questions. I just think, and they're hard questions are good about these because they were certainly not all perfect.
Mm-hmm. I think we'll find that as we go forward into the commemorations next year for sure, Colum. Yeah. Okay, folks. I'm just having a quick look in the chat here. If there's any other questions, we'll take them now. If anybody wanted to unmute their mic. Sinead, hello Sinead, how are you? Sinead Brennan is our colleague here in the Jackie Clarke collection, so I'll leave it over to you, Sinead.
Hi everyone. I suppose just a couple of comments to start with, Professor Kenny. Just want to compliment you on your talk and in particular your book on Arthur Griffith last year. I think long overdue, and as you alluded to, a good antidote to Lord Lucan's book. And I think some of the myths that were busted, for want of a better word, in it were also long overdue. I just wonder, just on a personal note, do you think that your own career in journalism has helped you with your affinity and maybe respect for Griffith as a fellow journalist and a fellow media man? And my other question was, and I suppose coming in really on what Dermot said as well, and I agree a lot with what Dermot said, has the time for us now to come to reassess the treaty from the British point of view, and for us to concede that they did make concessions, and that we're obviously very hung up on the oath and boundary commission and all the treaty entails, but do we now need to come to a mature reassessment of the treaty and say that the British did actually concede a lot? And I suppose my last thing is just a comment, I think, and just really inspired by your last slide there. The Jackie Clarke collection, as you know, is home to 100,000 items of Irish history collected by a lifelong Republican. But there's a huge body of material dedicated to Arthur Griffith and many of his newspapers. So I think that just kind of shows that Jackie Clarke recognised Griffith's contribution, to that period in history, albeit that they would have had very different political leanings. But he did obviously go out of his way to collect all that material as a way of telling the complete story and to look at it all in context and not just as different individuals. That's everything. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I love the question. I hadn't thought about this. I guess I do sympathise as a journalist. I admire his journalism, actually, because he was working basically on his own, with maybe a couple of voluntary helpers at all the time, getting these papers out, producing them himself half the time, and great difficulties with raids taking place. And they're really a great read. And they're very hard to get hold of sometimes. When I was I wanted to, for instance, get some images from the Sinn Féin newspaper at one point. The condition of them was so bad of what they had in Trinity, they couldn't even show them to me. And in the National Library, they very kindly made a big favour of bringing them and showing them to me, but I couldn't even touch them. They were falling apart. And there's papers missing, and so it's so important that these things get digitized while we still have them. because they were influential. A bit like the old, a bit like a rural newspaper, a weekly rural news, country news, regional press, particularly a few decades ago, when it would come into a house. You know, the weekly papers of Arthur Griffith, they mightn't sell in vast numbers, but they had an enormous number of readers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they'd be read all week long. They wouldn't just be something people would pick up like a daily paper now or something, or a news bulletin on the radio, and it'd be gone again. It'd be around and it would be discussed. And, you know, as I said earlier, I think when you look at the Bureau of Military History witness statements, again and again, the people are talking about the influence of these papers, awakening them to nationalism and to national pride. So, you know, I think, I think they're a great resource. And there's a good book there'd be a book alone in the United Irish. I mean, just there's so much in it. And Joyce, as I said earlier, was such a great admirer of it. And there's a reason for that. It wasn't that he agreed with everything in it, or he agreed with Griffith always, but he saw life in it. He saw a bit of enterprise, you know, a bit of desire for industry in Ireland and building things up that were our own, and that they weren't afraid they weren't going to kowtow to people, you know, and that's all there in those papers. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered all your questions. I'm not sure if there was another one, but thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
I see there's somebody related to Skellig Kelly here who's saying, you know, it'd be nice to talk about that. But if you want to email me, you can email me at Dublin City University, whoever that is. Joe Cully, I think, is it? I see a message there, and I'd be happy to answer you and to talk about that if I have anything I can tell you.
Great. Yeah, we have some lovely comments in there. Colum, just fantastic, insightful thought. Thanks to Colum and JCC. Thank you for an enlightening lecture. You've pointed towards the importance of the approaching issue with an open mind, Gurmaya, and a very enjoyable talk. So, Senan, have you a question there? I see. Yeah, let me just see if I can unmute you. Oh, thank you from Senan as well. That's great. So I think that might conclude the questions there, unless anybody else wants to come in it. But again, just to reiterate what everybody is saying in the comments, it was really insightful, and we are approaching that period in history now, and I think we can approach it with a bit more knowledge of the finer detail in it. For ourselves at the Jackie Clarke collection, on the 6th of December, we actually online will be launching our own video that we have done about an item here in the collection, the Treaty Notebook. We have a wonderful autograph book column. I might have explained it to you before, that is full of the signatories of everybody that was involved from that December 6th right through to the votes in January. And it's a really, really wonderful piece of history that travelled from London to Dublin and was in the hands of many important people. So we have a wonderful video coming out shortly on the 6th of December with Anula Productions. So keep an eye out for that, folks, online. We'll be posting it on Facebook and all the usual places as well. And just
I think that's great. I think they're really lovely. And I think, and I just say, sorry for interrupting, you know, I think maybe we're able now to begin to talk about these things, you know, and it's so important to remember them, you know, and without necessarily bringing in all the bitterness. One of the nicest tributes paid to Arthur Griffith when he died was paid from Mountjoy Jail by Sean O'Kelly, who'd been locked up, the future president of Ireland, who was on the other side. And he wrote to Griffith's widow, you know, and it was very fine. And it wasn't all bitterness and nastiness, you know. The Civil War was a terrific tragedy, and we lost a decade and it did enormous damage. But, you know, we can talk about it now and learn from it, and it's very important that we do that, I think. And I think, you know, things like the Jackie Clarke collection, resources like that are really wonderful to have, and people should go in and use them. And you get in touch with a period by feeling the kind of actually taking in your hands the materials of the time. There's nothing like it to make a connection, I think.
That's for sure, Colum. Yeah. Thank you so much. So yeah, as I said, that kind of concludes our talk tonight. So if you do happen to see this anywhere on your travels, folks, I would definitely recommend picking it up. It's a wonderful read. As Sinead said, Colum is approaching it as well from a communications and a journalistic point of view. So it's actually quite a lovely, you know, easy read as well for a topic that is so heavy. So it's definitely worth it if you spot it and you want to know more about it. Now, I know Colum covered so much of it tonight, but it's a really in-depth book, as I said, and a great read. And thank you so much, Colum. And hopefully we will have you down in Ballina physically soon. Oh yes, Shane, you've got
this one.
Yeah, that's great. Hopefully we will have Colum down in Ballina in the new year for further talks, and we will physically all be together, which would be very, very nice. But I'll conclude it there, folks. Great to see you all. For anyone that might have missed the video, we'll make it available online in the coming week, so that if you know anybody that would have liked to have listened to Colum, it'll be there on our Facebook and usual channels as well. So just to wish everyone good night, and I suppose enjoy the news and whatever RTE and all the different channels do over the next couple of days. And I'm sure Monday will be a busy day on TV as well, with the treaty, commemorating it and looking back over it 100 years ago. Thank you very much, folks.